Welcome to Northern Mystery Archives. Here we don't soften the truth and we don't skip the details. We investigate the forgotten files from the far north of Canada, the disappearances that were quietly shelved, the settlements that faded from every map, the transmissions that were never meant to be heard again. In this channel, nothing is hidden. Every fragment, every silence, every erased trail is examined with the seriousness these cases deserved but never received. If you value cold, atmospheric, minimalist investigations into the unexplained wilderness of the North, you're in the right place. Subscribe, stay close, and step with us into the files they hoped no one would ever revisit. Below, we will be speaking about the case titled Gareth Holloway, Winter 1987, Forgotten Forest Outpost Incident. It existed on maps for exactly 19 months before those same maps were revised and the location removed entirely. No explanation was recorded. No formal closure was documented. The site simply ceased to be referenced in any official capacity after March of 1987. What remains are fragments, radio logs with missing pages, a supply manifest that ends mid-sentence, 3 rolls of undeveloped film found in a locker 200 kilometers south of where they should have been, and a series of witness statements that contradict each other so thoroughly that investigators at the time noted their uselessness in the margins of their own reports. Gareth Holloway was 31 years old when he accepted the posting. He had worked for the Provincial Natural Resources Division for 7 years, primarily conducting solo monitoring assignments in remote locations across the northern interior. His supervisors described him as reliable, methodical, and unusually comfortable with isolation. He had spent winters alone before. He knew the protocols. He understood the risks. The outpost itself was located approximately 63 kilometers northwest of a settlement too small to warrant a name on most maps. Local hunters referred to the area as the Benning Creek drainage, though no creek by that name appears in any registry. The terrain was dense boreal forest interspersed with muskeg and shallow frozen wetlands. In winter, temperatures regularly fell below -30. The nearest maintained road ended 18 kilometers to the south. Holloway was transported to the site by helicopter on the 9th of December, 1986. The pilot's log noted clear conditions and an uneventful flight. Holloway carried standard cold weather gear, enough supplies for 8 weeks, a shortwave radio transmitter, and a backup battery array powered by a small generator. He was expected to maintain daily contact and provide readings on ground frost depth, snow density, and wildlife activity patterns. His first transmission came through as scheduled on the evening of December 9th. The voice was calm, the data was routine, nothing suggested any irregularity. For the next 4 weeks, Holloway transmitted every evening at 1800 hours without fail. His reports were brief, technical, and unremarkable. On 3 occasions, he mentioned hearing wolves in the distance. Once, he noted that the generator had required minor repairs. Otherwise, his observations followed the expected patterns for that region and season. Then, on the evening of January 6, 1987, his transmission lasted longer than usual. The recording was archived and later reviewed multiple times by investigators. In it, Holloway described finding tracks near the outpost that he could not identify. He stated that the prints were larger than any wolf he had encountered, spaced irregularly, and appeared to circle the structure repeatedly during the previous night. He did not sound alarmed. He noted the observation as a curiosity and moved on to his standard data reporting. The following evening, January 7th, his transmission was shorter. He confirmed that the tracks had returned. This time, they had approached the door of the outpost itself. He mentioned that he had checked his perimeter twice and found no signs of disturbance beyond the tracks. He said he would document them photographically the next morning if conditions allowed. On January 8th, Holloway missed his scheduled transmission. This was not immediately considered unusual. Equipment failures, atmospheric interference, and minor injuries were all documented reasons for missed check-ins. Protocol required a follow-up attempt after 24 hours. When January 9th passed with no contact, the district office began to take notice. A second helicopter was dispatched on January 11th, weather permitting. The pilot reached the site just after noon. What he found was recorded in his official statement, filed 2 days later. The outpost structure was intact. The door was closed, but not locked. Inside, the interior showed no signs of struggle or disorder. Holloway's personal belongings were present. His sleeping bag was still laid out. Food supplies remained in their designated storage. The radio equipment was functional and powered. Holloway himself was gone. His winter coat was missing. His boots were missing. But his backup cold weather gear remained untouched. The generator was still running. The stove had gone out, but there was fuel available. On the small table near the radio, there was a handwritten log. The final entry was dated January 8th and consisted of a single sentence. They have been here 3 nights now. The pilot searched the immediate area on foot for approximately 30 minutes before returning to report. A full search and rescue operation was initiated the following day. Ground teams, additional air support and tracking dogs were deployed across a radius of 15 kilometers. The search continued for 6 days. The region surrounding Outpost 47 has no official name. It exists in the vast stretch of northern wilderness that lies beyond the reach of permanent settlement, too remote for logging operations, too inhospitable for recreational use. It is a landscape defined by absence. There are no roads, no trails, no marked boundaries. It is a place where coordinates matter more than names. The forest itself is old. Black spruce dominate, their trunks thin and gnarled, their branches heavy with decades of accumulated needlefall. In winter, the snow settles unevenly, caught in dense thickets, piling against deadfall, creating a terrain that is deceptive in its stillness. What appears to be solid ground may be muskeg beneath a thin crust of ice. What seems like a clearing may be a frozen pond waiting to collapse under weight. The area had been selected for monitoring precisely because of its isolation. The data collected there would represent conditions largely unaffected by human activity. It was considered an ideal location for baseline environmental readings. No industrial development had ever reached that far north. No settlements had ever been established within 50 kilometers. Even indigenous traplines, once common in the region, had been abandoned decades earlier for reasons that were never formally documented. The outpost structure was prefabricated. It had been airlifted in sections and assembled on site during the previous summer. It measured 4 meters by 5 meters, elevated slightly above ground level on treated timber supports. The walls were insulated. There were 2 small windows, both facing south. A single door faced east. Inside, there was space for a cot, a work table, storage shelves, and the radio equipment. It was designed for function, not comfort. Gareth Holloway had reviewed the site specifications before accepting the assignment. He had conducted similar postings in comparable locations. He understood that winter isolation required mental discipline as much as physical preparation. He had told his supervisor that he preferred solo work. He found the stillness clarifying. He appreciated the absence of distraction. He was, by all accounts, well suited to the assignment. The helicopter pilot who transported him to the site in December recalled the flight clearly when interviewed later. Holloway had been quiet but not withdrawn. He had asked questions about the surrounding terrain, noting landmarks, committing details to memory. When they landed, he had moved efficiently, unloading supplies without assistance. Before the pilot departed, Holloway had waved once turned and entered the outpost without looking back. The pilot said it was the last time anyone saw him under circumstances that could be called ordinary. The area's history is sparse. Archival records mention occasional trapping activity in the early 20th century, but no permanent camps were ever established. A forestry survey conducted in 1963 noted unusual tree growth patterns in the region, with several stands showing signs of damage inconsistent with fire or disease. The report suggested further investigation, but none was ever conducted. By the time Outpost 47 was established, those earlier records had been largely forgotten. Local hunters, when questioned after Holloway's disappearance, provided inconsistent accounts. Some claimed the area was known for strange sounds during winter months. Others dismissed such claims as folklore. One individual, who declined to be named in official reports, stated that his grandfather had refused to trap in that region, saying the forest did not welcome people. When pressed for details, he said only that his grandfather had found tracks there once that convinced him never to return. The tracks he described were similar to those Holloway had reported, large, irregularly spaced, without clear origin or destination, just circling. Weather records for January 1987 show typical conditions for the region. Temperatures ranged from -22 to -35 degrees Celsius. Snowfall was moderate. Visibility on most days was adequate. There were no storms severe enough to prevent helicopter operations for more than 48 hours at a time. Nothing in the meteorological data suggests that environmental factors alone could account for what happened. What remains unexplained is why Holloway would have left the outpost voluntarily under those conditions. Exposure in such temperatures without proper gear is fatal within hours. He was experienced enough to know this. He had stated in previous reports that he followed strict protocols regarding outdoor activity during extreme cold. He would not have left without cause, yet his coat was gone, his boots were gone, and he had left everything else behind. The search teams that arrived days later found the outpost exactly as the pilot had described. Nothing inside suggested panic, nothing indicated threat. The environment was orderly. The only anomaly was Holloway's absence and the single sentence written in his log. They have been here 3 nights now. The use of the word "they" would become a point of fixation for investigators. Holloway had not specified who or what he meant. He had not elaborated. The timeline of Gareth Holloway's final days at Outpost 47 can be reconstructed only through the radio transmissions he made and the physical evidence later recovered. What cannot be reconstructed is his reasoning. What cannot be explained is the choice he made to leave. On January 6, during his scheduled evening transmission, Holloway first mentioned the tracks. His tone was neutral, clinical even. He described them as appearing overnight, circling the outpost at a distance of approximately 20 meters. He estimated the stride length at roughly 1 meter, which he noted was inconsistent with any known wildlife in the region. He said the depth of the prints suggested significant weight, but the pattern of movement was irregular, not following any logical path. He concluded the transmission by stating he would monitor the situation and provide updates. There was no request for assistance. No indication of concern. It was treated as an observational note, nothing more. The transmission on January 7th was different, shorter, more direct. Holloway reported that the tracks had returned and had come closer. This time they had approached the door of the outpost. He said he had gone outside during daylight to examine them more closely. The prints, he noted, were partially obscured by fresh snow, but remained visible enough to confirm they were the same as the night before. He mentioned one detail that later investigators found significant. He said the tracks did not appear to leave the area. They circled. They approached. But there was no clear trail leading away from the outpost. It was as if whatever had made them had simply stopped moving once it reached the structure and remained there, unmoving, until it left no further trace. Holloway ended the transmission by saying he had secured the door and would maintain a watch through the night. He did not elaborate on what he expected to see. He simply signed off and the line went silent. January 8th was the last day anyone heard from Gareth Holloway. His scheduled transmission never came. The radio remained silent, and the final entry in his handwritten log was discovered days later, undated but presumably written sometime on the 8th. They have been here 3 nights now. The search teams that arrived on January 12th began their work with standard protocols. They established a search perimeter. They documented the scene inside the outpost. They followed any visible tracks radiating outward from the structure. What they found complicated the investigation more than it clarified anything. The tracks that Holloway had described were still visible, though degraded by wind and subsequent snowfall. The search team leader, a provincial conservation officer with 2 decades of experience, examined them carefully. In his report, he stated that the prints did not match any identifiable animal. They were too large for wolves, too irregular for moose. The spacing suggested bipedal movement, but the depth and shape were inconsistent with human footprints. More troubling was the fact that the tracks did not lead away. They encircled the outpost, approached it from multiple angles, and then simply stopped. There were no trails extending beyond the immediate area. It was as if whatever had made them had arrived, circled, and then ceased to exist. The dogs brought in to assist with the search behaved strangely near the outpost. 2 refused to approach the structure at all. A 3rd entered briefly, but then retreated and would not go back inside. The handlers noted this in their reports but offered no explanation. Dogs trained for search and rescue work are conditioned to ignore distractions. Their refusal to engage was considered unusual enough to document. Ground teams expanded their search radius over the following days. They covered terrain in every direction, moving systematically through forest, over frozen wetlands, along ridgelines. They found nothing, no clothing, no equipment, no sign that Holloway had traveled in any direction from the outpost. It was as if he had stepped outside and simply vanished. On the 4th day of the search, one team discovered something approximately 3 kilometers north of the outpost, a section of forest where the trees showed signs of damage, branches broken at irregular heights, bark stripped from trunks in vertical patterns. The ground beneath was disturbed, the snow compacted in a way that suggested recent activity, but there were no tracks, no footprints, no indication of what had caused the damage or when it had occurred. The team leader photographed the site and marked its location. When questioned later, he said the damage did not appear consistent with animal activity. It was too methodical, too extensive, and it was focused in a way that suggested intent rather than random destruction. But he could not say what had caused it or whether it was connected to Holloway's disappearance. Another team, working east of the outpost, found a piece of fabric snagged on low brush approximately 2 kilometers from the structure. The fabric was identified as matching the material of Holloway's winter coat. It was torn, not cut. There was no blood on it, no other evidence nearby, just a single fragment caught on a branch, offering no context, no direction, no answers. The search continued until January 18th, when deteriorating weather conditions forced a suspension. In total, more than 40 personnel had participated. Helicopters had surveyed the region from above. Ground teams had covered over 200 square kilometers. The effort had been thorough. The results were non-existent. Gareth Holloway had disappeared as completely as if he had never been there at all. The final transmission recordings were reviewed repeatedly. Audio technicians analyzed them for background sounds, anomalies, anything that might provide insight. The disappearance of Gareth Holloway was officially classified as a missing person case under unexplained circumstances. The file remained open, but active investigation ceased after the initial search efforts yielded no results. What followed was a series of reviews, inquiries, and attempts to construct an explanation from incomplete evidence. The Provincial Natural Resources Division conducted an internal review of the Outpost program. Questions were raised about the wisdom of single-person postings in such remote locations. Protocols were examined. Safety procedures were scrutinized. The review concluded that Holloway had followed all established guidelines and that his disappearance could not be attributed to negligence or procedural failure. The Outpost program itself was quietly discontinued 6 months later, though no direct connection to Holloway's case was cited in official documentation. Investigators interviewed everyone who had been in contact with Holloway during the weeks preceding his disappearance. His supervisor confirmed that all transmissions prior to January 6th had been routine. Holloway had reported no equipment issues, no health concerns, no difficulties adapting to the isolation. He had been in good spirits during their last direct conversation on December 30th. He had mentioned looking forward to completing the assignment and returning in February as scheduled. Family members were interviewed. Holloway's older brother described him as calm, rational, and deeply self-reliant. He said Gareth had never expressed fear of wilderness environments. He had thrived in solitude. He had prepared carefully for the posting and had expressed confidence in his ability to manage the isolation. Nothing in his behavior prior to departure suggested instability or distress. Colleagues who had worked with Holloway on previous assignments were also questioned. They uniformly described him as competent, focused, and unusually comfortable with the demands of remote monitoring work. One colleague recalled a conversation in which Holloway had said he preferred the stillness of winter forests because it allowed him to think clearly. He had said that isolation was not loneliness if you understood what you were listening for. When asked what he meant, Holloway had smiled and said the forest had its own rhythms, and if you paid attention, you could hear them. The physical evidence recovered from the outpost was analyzed extensively. The handwritten log was examined by forensic specialists. The handwriting was confirmed as Holloway's. There were no signs of duress in the writing itself. The sentence, "They have been here 3 nights now," was written in steady script, no hesitation, no erratic letter formation. It was a statement of fact, recorded calmly. The undeveloped film discovered months later in a storage locker 200 kilometers south presented another mystery. The film had been logged as part of Holloway's personal equipment, but had never been mentioned in his transmissions. When developed, the images showed the interior and exterior of the outpost, standard documentation shots. But the final 3 frames were different. They showed the forest at night, illuminated by what appeared to be flashlight. The images were grainy, out of focus, but they captured something standing among the trees. The shape was indistinct, too tall to be human, too vertical to be an animal. It stood motionless, partially obscured by branches. In the second frame, it was closer. In the third frame, the camera appeared to have been dropped. The image showed only snow and darkness. Those photographs were never released to the public. They were retained in the investigative file and classified as inconclusive. The official position was that the images could not be definitively interpreted and may have resulted from camera malfunction or accidental exposure. No further analysis was conducted. Radio transmission logs were cross-referenced with meteorological data, wildlife activity reports, and historical records of the region. No correlations emerged, no patterns could be identified. The transmissions themselves offered no explanation beyond what Holloway had stated. Something had approached the outpost. He had observed it, he had documented it, and then he had left. One investigator, whose name was redacted from later reports, submitted a supplementary memo suggesting that Holloway may have experienced psychological breakdown due to isolation. The memo cited established research on the effects of prolonged solitude and extreme environmental stress. It proposed that Holloway had perceived a threat that did not exist and had fled the outpost in a state of confusion. The memo was filed but not formally adopted. Other investigators noted that Holloway's transmissions showed no signs of deteriorating mental state and that his behavior prior to January 6th had been entirely consistent with his established patterns. Another line of inquiry focused on the possibility of human involvement. Could someone else have been in the area? Could Holloway have encountered another person, leading to confrontation or abduction? The region's remoteness made this unlikely, but not impossible. Investigators checked records for any reported activity in the vicinity: hunting licenses, trapping permits, forestry operations. Nothing was found. The area was documented as entirely unoccupied during that period. No other helicopter flights had been logged. No other vehicles had been recorded on access roads. If someone else had been there, they had left no trace. The fabric found 2 kilometers east of the outpost was subjected to additional analysis. The tear pattern was examined. Fibers were studied under magnification. The conclusion was that the fabric had been torn by force, likely caught on something and pulled free. But what had caused the tear could not be determined. There were no tool marks, no clean edges that would suggest a blade. Just ragged tearing consistent with snagging and pulling. The damage to the trees 3 kilometers north was photographed extensively and samples were taken. Forestry experts reviewed the evidence. The damage was recent, occurring within days of Holloway's disappearance, but its cause remained unexplained. One expert noted that the pattern of broken branches suggested upward force, as if something had climbed or moved vertically through the trees. But no known animal in the region exhibited such behavior. Another expert suggested wind damage, but admitted the pattern was inconsistent with typical storm effects. The search dog's refusal to enter the outpost was noted, but not investigated further. Animal behavior specialists were not consulted. The handlers attributed it to possible residual scents or environmental factors. No formal explanation was documented. By March of 1987, the investigation had effectively stalled. No new evidence emerged. No witnesses came forward. The case remained classified as open but unsolved. In the absence of conclusive evidence, theories emerged. Some were grounded in rational explanation. Others strayed into speculation. None were ever confirmed. The most commonly cited theory was environmental exposure combined with disorientation. Proponents argued that Holloway, for reasons unknown, had left the outpost without adequate gear and had succumbed to the extreme cold. The lack of a body was explained by the possibility that he had fallen through ice, been buried by subsequent snowfall, or had traveled far enough that searchers simply missed him. This theory was supported by the harshness of the conditions and the vastness of the search area. Critics of this theory pointed to Holloway's experience and training. He was not a novice. He understood cold weather survival. He would not have left without his gear unless compelled by extraordinary circumstances. And if he had been compelled, what had compelled him? The theory offered no answer to that question. Another theory proposed animal predation. Large predators, while uncommon in the region, were not absent. A wolf pack or an unusually aggressive bear could have posed a threat. Holloway might have been forced to flee, leading to his death and subsequent scavenging of remains. This would explain the absence of a body and the difficulty in locating any trace. But this theory failed to account for the tracks. Holloway had described them as inconsistent with known wildlife. The search teams had found prints that did not match any catalogued species. If an animal had been responsible, it was not one that investigators could identify. And animals do not circle structures repeatedly without attempting entry or departure. The behavior Holloway described did not align with predator patterns. A third theory, less widely discussed, suggested human involvement. Perhaps someone else had been in the area, perhaps Holloway had encountered them, perhaps conflict had occurred. This theory was considered but quickly dismissed due to lack of evidence. No other footprints, no signs of struggle, no motive, no suspects. The region's isolation made the presence of another person highly improbable. An investigator in an off-record conversation years later suggested that Holloway had been lured. He did not elaborate on what he meant by lured or by whom. He simply stated that the pattern of behavior, the circling tracks, the repeated approach over multiple nights suggested deliberate intent. Something had wanted Holloway to leave the outpost, and eventually he had. This theory was never formalized. It remained a personal observation, shared quietly and never included in official documentation. It raised questions that had no framework for answers. If something had wanted Holloway to leave, what was that something, and why? Local explanations, gathered informally from hunters and trappers familiar with the region, offered a different perspective. Several individuals mentioned stories passed down through generations, stories of the forest behaving strangely in certain areas. Stories of sounds that had no source, stories of people who had entered the deep woods and had not returned. These stories were not specific to Holloway's case. They predated it by decades, but they shared common elements: isolation, circling, disappearance. One trapper, interviewed years after the incident, said his grandfather had called certain parts of the northern forest walking ground. When asked what that meant, he explained that his grandfather believed some places were used by things that did not stay still. They moved through. They circled. They walked the boundaries of their territory. And if you were there when they walked, you became part of the walking. He said his grandfather had seen tracks like the ones Holloway described. He had heard the breathing. He had left and never gone back. This account was dismissed as folklore. It was not included in investigative reports, but it lingered in the margins, an explanation that defied categorization. Another theory, proposed by a researcher studying environmental psychology, suggested that prolonged isolation in extreme conditions could produce perceptual distortions. Holloway might have hallucinated the presence of something outside the outpost. His fear, though unfounded, might have driven him to flee. This theory aligned with the psychological breakdown hypothesis, but was more specific in attributing the cause to environmental stress rather than mental instability. The problem with this theory was Holloway's final log entry. He had written, "They have been here 3 nights now." The phrasing was matter-of-fact. It did not suggest hallucination. It suggested observation. And the tracks had been real. The search teams had confirmed their existence. Whatever Holloway had seen, it had left physical evidence. The undeveloped photographs complicated every theory. The images were ambiguous but undeniably present. Something had been photographed. Whether it was the source of the tracks, whether it had been real or a trick of light and shadow, remained unresolved. The photographs were archived and forgotten by most, but to those who had seen them, they represented the most tangible evidence that something had been there. In the years following the investigation, occasional attempts were made to revisit the case. Cold case units reviewed the files. Private investigators, hired by family members, explored the region. None produced new leads. The forest had reclaimed the outpost. The structure still stood, barely, but it was overgrown, collapsing, absorbed back into the wilderness. Visitors reported an oppressive stillness in the area. No birds, no wind, just silence. One investigator returning from a site visit in the mid-90s noted in his personal journal that he had felt watched the entire time he was there. He described it as an irrational sensation, but one he could not shake. He said the forest felt wrong. He left after 2 hours and did not return. Theories continued to circulate, rational, speculative, folkloric. But none brought Gareth Holloway home. None explained the tracks. None accounted for the 3 nights of circling. Gareth Holloway was declared legally dead in 1992, 5 years after his disappearance. No body had been recovered. No definitive evidence of his fate had been found. But the passage of time and the absence of any contact led to the inevitable conclusion. He was gone. His family held a memorial service. Colleagues from the Natural Resources Division attended. There were speeches about his dedication, his competence, his affinity for the wilderness. But there was no closure. Only acknowledgement that he would not be coming back. The outpost itself was never formally decommissioned. It was simply abandoned. Over the years, weather and neglect took their toll. The structure sagged. The roof collapsed partially. The door hung loose on its hinges. Nature reclaimed what had briefly been imposed upon it. The forest grew dense around the site, obscuring it from aerial view. The coordinates remained in archived files, but no one visited. No one maintained it. It became a ghost of a place that had itself been designed for ghosts, for the invisible work of monitoring an empty land. In 2003, a forestry crew working in the region stumbled upon the remains of the outpost. They reported it to their supervisors, who cross-referenced the location and discovered the connection to Holloway's case. A brief reinvestigation was considered, but ultimately not pursued. Too much time had passed. The evidence, if any remained, would be degraded beyond usefulness. The decision was made to let the site remain undisturbed. One member of that forestry crew later spoke to a journalist about what they had found. He said the area around the outpost was unnaturally quiet. He said the trees were dead for a radius of about 50 meters, standing but lifeless. He said they had found tracks, old and eroded, but still visible in the soil beneath the moss. Tracks that circled the outpost. Tracks that matched no animal he knew. He said they left quickly and did not go back. That account was published in a regional newspaper and then forgotten. It generated no follow-up, no official response. It was one more story added to the archive of stories that surround the case, all of them fragmentary, all of them inconclusive. Gareth Holloway's personal effects were eventually returned to his family. Among them were journals from previous assignments, photographs, letters. His brother kept them, hoping one day they might offer some insight. But the journals ended in November of 1986. The photographs showed forests and rivers and empty landscapes. The letters were ordinary, filled with mundane details and plans for the future. Nothing hinted at what would happen. Nothing foreshadowed the silence. The radio transmission recordings were archived by the provincial government. They remain accessible to investigators, but have not been reviewed in over a decade. The final transmission from January 7th sits in a digital repository, a voice speaking calmly into the void, describing something it could not explain, unaware that it would be the last time anyone would hear from him. The photographs, the 3 frames showing something in the trees, were never publicly released. They exist in a file marked inconclusive evidence. Occasionally, researchers request access. Most are denied. Those who have seen them describe a shape, tall and indistinct, standing motionless among the trees. They describe the sense that it was aware of the camera, that it was looking back. But these are subjective impressions. The images themselves offer no certainty, only suggestion, only the possibility of presence. In recent years, interest in the case has resurfaced periodically. True crime podcasts have covered it. Online forums have debated it. Armchair investigators have proposed new theories, but the fundamental facts remain unchanged. Gareth Holloway went to a remote outpost in December of 1986. He transmitted regularly until January 6th. He reported tracks, he reported presence, and then he disappeared. The forest where he vanished remains as remote as it was then. No development has reached it. No new settlements have been established nearby. It is still a place defined by absence. Still a place where coordinates matter more than names. Still a place where the silence is absolute and the cold is unforgiving. The case file, archived and largely forgotten, sits in a government records facility somewhere far from the forest. It contains witness statements, search reports, radio logs, photographs, and unanswered questions. It is labeled unsolved. It is labeled inactive. But it is not closed, because some files are never truly closed. Some disappearances never resolve. Some people step into the wilderness and become part of it, absorbed into the silence, the cold, the endless circling of things that leave tracks, but no answers. Gareth Holloway is still missing. Outpost 47 is still standing, barely, in a forest that does not welcome visitors. And the tracks, when the snow falls deep enough, are still there, circling, approaching.